What happens when the woman you threw away for a shiny new toy suddenly becomes the queen of your entire empire? Welcome back to Midnight Romance. If you are ready to watch a toxic ex get absolutely dismantled by his own arrogance, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on those notifications. The ultimate checkmate is about to begin. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the gala, and the aftershocks were still tearing through Chicago's elite like a seismic event. Senna Waverly was no longer the discarded, pitied housewife. She was the reigning obsession of the city's rumor mill. But while society whispered about the spectacular, calculated revenge she was supposedly plotting against Vaughn, the reality unfolding behind the high-security gates of Evander Hayes' sprawling estate was something entirely different. It wasn't a scheme. It was an awakening. Senna and Evander sat across from each other in his private, mahogany-lined library, an antique chessboard resting between them. The roaring fireplace cast a warm, golden glow across Senna's face as she systematically trapped Evander's king with a ruthless knight maneuver. Evander didn't look frustrated by his impending defeat. He looked utterly captivated. For 25 years, Vaughn had treated Senna's brilliant mind as a convenient administrative tool, something to organize his life behind the scenes. Evander treated her intellect like a revelation. They rarely spoke of Vaughn. To Evander, his junior executive was a disappointing liability. To Senna, he was an insignificant speck in the rearview mirror of her new life. Instead, they spent hours talking about global markets, classic literature, and the quiet, agonizing reality of rebuilding a life after the foundation crumbles. Evander spoke of his late wife with a gentle, lingering sorrow, a vulnerability he hid from his cutthroat corporate board. Senna met his grief with profound empathy, and in return, she spoke of the suffocating, muted box she had folded herself into for decades just to make Vaughn look taller. "You were never meant to be a shadow, Senna," Evander said quietly, his deep voice carrying across the quiet room as he leaned back in his leather armchair. He studied her, not as a prize to be won or a trophy to be displayed, but as a true equal. She was a 48-year-old woman who had been told by her ex-husband that her best years were behind her, that she was easily replaceable by a 22-year-old in silver silk. Yet, sitting under the adoring, intensely focused gaze of a self-made billionaire, Senna realized her reign hadn't ended at all. It was just beginning. And somewhere in a downtown luxury condo, completely unaware of the absolute storm gathering over his head, the man who threw her away was about to realize just how steep the drop from the top could be. The honeymoon phase of her new life was violently interrupted by the screech of tires and the shatter of safety glass. Senna still remembered the terrifying lack of resistance when she pressed the brake pedal of her sedan on a rain-slicked Chicago overpass. The crash had been horrific, a tangled mess of steel that she had miraculously walked away from with only bruised ribs. The police called it a catastrophic mechanical failure, dismissing the strangely severed brake line as a freak anomaly. But Senna knew. She knew the desperate, cornered animal Vaughn had become, watching his corporate future hang in the balance while her new relationship flourished. She just couldn't prove it in court, leaving a dark, paranoid shadow hanging over her every move. The sheer terror of the botched assassination attempt, combined with the brutal, sudden onset of menopause, pushed Senna's body into a state of total rebellion. Some days, the hormonal storms were suffocating. The fierce, calculated woman who had brought a billionaire to his knees was suddenly waking up at 3 in the morning drenched in sweat, paralyzed by irrational anxiety, and weeping from the sheer, crushing weight of her own mind. She felt entirely out of control, terrified that Evander, a man who had his pick of the world's most composed, youthful women, would see this chaotic, fragile version of her and walk away. Instead, Evander anchored her. When the hot flashes left her dizzy and exhausted, he didn't pawn her off on a team of nurses. He canceled his multi-million-dollar board meetings, drew the heavy curtains in his estate, and sat beside her for hours, holding her hand with a quiet, unshakable devotion. "You are allowed to break," he whispered one evening, pressing a cool towel to her forehead while she cried from sheer emotional exhaustion. You fought for 25 years. Now you let me fight for you. I am not going anywhere. To prove it and to ease the lingering paranoia of Vaughn's failed hit, Evander brought home two sleek, fiercely loyal Doberman pinschers, Apollo and Artemis. Since Senna and Vaughn had remained childless by Vaughn's selfish design, the sprawling estate had sometimes felt too vast, too quiet. Now, the dogs shadowed her every move, leaning their warm, protective weight against her legs and grounding her shattered nerves. Realizing she needed to escape the claustrophobic, dangerous shadows of Chicago to truly heal, Evander completely removed her from the board. He chartered his private jet, and they vanished. They spent a month in a secluded cliffside villa in the Amalfi Coast, trading the vicious rumors of the city for quiet mornings drinking espresso on a sun-drenched terrace, a dog resting at each of her sides. They sailed through the Greek islands and walked the quiet, snow-dusted streets of a Swiss ski village. Vaughn had tried to break her body and her mind, hoping the stress would shatter her new relationship. But all his cruelty had accomplished was showing Senna exactly how fiercely and unconditionally she was finally loved. While Senna was rediscovering her peace across the Atlantic, the walls of Vaughn's new reality in Chicago were rapidly closing in. The sprawling, minimalist condo he had purchased for Inessa felt less like a romantic sanctuary and more like a high-altitude, sterile prison. The financial bleeding had become catastrophic. Inessa's tastes were not just exorbitant, they were completely insatiable. Exclusive designer capsules, impulsive solo trips to Aspen, and a rotating staff of personal assistants were draining the liquidity from the very accounts he had so carefully hidden during the divorce. But the hemorrhaging of his bank accounts was nothing compared to the suffocating, daily terror of his own paranoia. Vaughn knew the assassination attempt had failed. Every time an unmarked car idled too long outside his building, or a heavy knock echoed against his door, his heart hammered violently against his ribs. Worse, he knew Evander Hayes had taken Senna away, effectively shielding her behind a fortress of billionaire-tier security and international airspace. The silence from the Apex conglomerate board was deafening. Evander hadn't fired him. He hadn't called the authorities. He had simply left Vaughn to stew in his own agonizing anticipation, a mouse waiting in the dark for the trap to finally snap shut. You are sweating again, Vaughn. It is repulsive. Inessa's voice, thick with a bored Russian lilt, cut through the oppressive silence of the living room. She didn't bother to look up from her phone, lounging on a stark white leather sofa that Vaughn was still paying off. She wore a heavy diamond tennis bracelet he had bought her the day the police officially closed Senna's car crash as an accident, a frantic, guilty purchase to calm his own unraveling nerves. Vaughn poured himself his fourth scotch of the morning, his hand trembling so violently the crystal decanter clinked against the rim of his glass. The quarterly executive reviews are coming up, he muttered, packing the length of the floor, desperately trying to project a corporate dominance he hadn't felt in months. Evander is returning to the city this week. I just have to prepare my defense. I need to secure my position. Inessa finally looked up, her glacial eyes narrowing with a sharp, terrifyingly calculating glint. She was young, but she was far from stupid. She saw the fraying, pathetic edges of the man she had attached herself to. The charismatic, powerful millionaire she had met was entirely gone, replaced by a twitchy, paranoid wreck drowning in bottom-shelf liquor and mounting credit card debt. He took your ex-wife to Switzerland, Inessa stated flatly, twisting the knife with casual, absolute cruelty as she admired her manicured nails. And you are here, shaking over a spreadsheet like a junior clerk. Perhaps I placed my bets on the wrong horse. The return to Chicago was not a retreat, it was a deployment. After months of sun-drenched Italian terraces and crisp Swiss air, Senna stepped off Evander's private jet a completely remade woman. The terrifying hormonal storms and paralyzing anxiety that had threatened to drown her had finally settled, tamed by expert medical care and Evander's relentless, grounding patience. She looked vibrant, dangerous, and utterly untouchable. Flanked by the two massive Dobermans, Apollo and Artemis, who never left her side, Senna walked across the tarmac with the lethal grace of a predator returning to her territory. It was time to finish what Vaughn had started. Across the city, Vaughn's trembling hands struggled to fasten his platinum cufflinks. A heavy, wax-sealed envelope sat like a live grenade on his glass vanity. It was a direct summons from Evander Hayes, demanding Vaughn's presence at a private, intimate dinner at the billionaire's estate to discuss his future trajectory within the conglomerate. The letter explicitly requested that he bring his partner. To Vaughn's desperate, fraying mind, this was his lifeline. He frantically convinced himself that Evander, as a fellow ruthless businessman, was simply testing his resilience. If he could just project absolute confidence, brush off the messiness of the divorce, and parade Inessa as a symbol of his high-status vitality, he could still secure his promotion to the C-suite. He just needed to survive one dinner. Inessa had scoffed at the mandate, only agreeing to attend when Vaughn promised her a massive transfer of funds he didn't actually possess. She slipped into a backless, liquid gold gown, radiating an icy, impatient boredom as they climbed into the back of their town car. She knew Vaughn was drowning, and she was simply waiting for the perfect moment to step off the sinking ship. The wrought iron gates of the Hayes estate opened like the jaws of a trap, swallowing the car into the sprawling, forested grounds. When the heavy oak doors of the manor were pulled open by the silent, impeccably dressed staff, Vaughn plastered on his most charismatic, practiced smile, stepping into the grand foyer ready to grovel for his empire. But the person waiting to greet them in the cavernous hall wasn't Evander. A low, terrifying growl echoed against the marble. Apollo and Artemis stepped out of the shadows, the two massive Dobermans locking their dark eyes onto Vaughn with a chilling, silent menace. And standing perfectly still behind them, pouring a glass of vintage Bollinger in a breathtaking, structured black gown, was Senna. She looked entirely at home, radiating absolute authority. She didn't even bother to look up as her voice sliced through the deadly silence of the foyer with terrifying calm. "You're exactly 4 minutes late, Vaughn. But then again, you never did know how to value other people's time." Vaughn felt the air vanish from his lungs. He stared at the two massive Dobermans, their muscles taut beneath sleek black coats, and then up to the woman he had discarded. Senna wasn't just standing in Evander Hayes' foyer, she was holding court in it. Before Vaughn could stammer a pathetic defense, heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed from the grand curved staircase. Evander descended, the picture of absolute, terrifying aristocratic power. He didn't look at his junior executive. He walked straight to Senna, wrapping a protective arm around her waist and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her temple. The casual, profound intimacy of the gesture was a physical blow to Vaughn. "I see our guests have arrived," Evander murmured, finally turning his silver gaze upon the sweating millionaire. "Vaughn and Miss Voronova." Inessa, who had been watching the entire exchange with the sharp, calculating eyes of a sniper, didn't flinch. Instead, a slow, dark smirk spread across her lips. She looked from Vaughn's pale, trembling face to Senna's commanding posture, instantly realizing the true power dynamic in the room. She knew she hadn't just bet on the wrong horse. She had bet on the one about to be led to the slaughter. "Mr. Hayes, Senna," Inessa said, her voice dropping its usual bored drawl replaced by a sudden, uncharacteristic respect. She stepped entirely out of Vaughn's shadow, distancing herself from him physically. "Your home is exquisite, and your security," she added, glancing at Apollo and Artemis, "is flawless." Senna offered a cool, knowing smile, her hand gently resting on Apollo's head. "We find them necessary, Inessa. One can never be too careful with sudden, mechanical failures." The terrifying reference to the severed brake lines hit Vaughn like a physical punch. He gasped, his hand gripping the edge of a marble console table just to stay upright. The blood roared in his ears. Evander's eyes locked onto Vaughn, cold, empty, and promising absolute ruin. "Shall we dine?" Evander asked, though it sounded entirely like a death sentence. The dining room became a theater of pure psychological torture. Vaughn was seated at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, practically isolated, while Senna and Evander sat together at the head. Course after course of culinary perfection tasted like ash in Vaughn's mouth. He couldn't stop staring at the heavy, flawless diamond necklace resting against Senna's collarbone, a piece that cost more than his entire remaining liquid portfolio. But the true agony came from his own side of the table. Inessa didn't speak a single word to Vaughn. Instead, she engaged Senna in a surprisingly sharp, intelligent conversation about the Swiss Alps and European art markets, completely ignoring the man who had bankrupted himself to buy her affection. Vaughn was trapped, forced to watch the woman he thought he had destroyed form a quiet, mutual understanding with the woman he had ruined himself to keep. And Evander just sat back, swirling his vintage wine, watching his junior executive drown in a sea of his own making with quiet, lethal satisfaction. The final plates were cleared away in suffocating silence, leaving only the dim flicker of candlelight reflecting off the crystal wine glasses. Evander did not offer cigars or a retreat to the study. Instead, he snapped his fingers. A silent aide stepped from the shadows, placing a thick, leather-bound dossier directly in front of Vaughn. Vaughn stared at the heavy folder, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck. He reached for it with trembling hands, desperately clinging to the delusion that this was a brutal but ultimately survivable corporate test, perhaps an assignment in a lesser branch. "Your quarterly review, Vaughn," Evander said, his voice as smooth and unforgiving as black ice. Or, more accurately, the findings of a very quiet, very thorough forensic audit I commissioned 3 months ago. Vaughn flipped open the cover. The pages were a massacre of his own arrogance. Every offshore transfer, every company credit line he had secretly bled dry to afford Inessa's designer capsules and the downtown condo was documented with terrifying precision. It was undeniable textbook embezzlement. "Mr. Hayes, I can explain," Vaughn choked out, the color utterly vanishing from his face. "These were temporary allocations. I was going to—" "You are going to do exactly 3 things," Evander interrupted, leaning forward, the raw, predatory power of the billionaire fully unmasked. The 2 Dobermans at Senna's feet simultaneously lifted their heads, a low rumble vibrating in their chests. "First, you will sign that termination agreement, surrendering your entire remaining severance, your stock options, and the deed to your condo to repay the Apex conglomerate what you stole. Second, you will leave this city by midnight, completely destitute." Vaughn's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. "And if I fight this, if I refuse?" Senna, who had been watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an insect, finally spoke. Her voice was terrifyingly soft. "If you refuse, Vaughn, Evander will hand that dossier over to the federal authorities, and while they are investigating your finances, I will personally fund a private, relentless reinvestigation into a certain severed brake line on my sedan. A mechanical failure might be hard to prove in criminal court, but in civil court, with unlimited resources, I will make sure you don't see the outside of a cell for the rest of your natural life." The trap had snapped shut. There was no negotiation. There was no grand corporate comeback. The sound of a chair scraping loudly against the mahogany floor shattered the tension. Inessa stood up, smoothing the liquid gold fabric of her gown with perfect composure. She didn't look at the trembling, ruined man beside her. She looked directly at Evander. "Mr. Hayes," Inessa said, her tone polite, entirely unfazed by the total annihilation of her boyfriend's life. "Could your staff be so kind as to call my driver? I find I have suddenly lost my appetite for dead weight." Vaughn let out a pathetic, strangled gasp as Inessa turned her back on him, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble as she walked out of his life without a single backward glance. He was entirely alone, bankrupt, terrified, and staring across the table at the woman he had broken, who was now holding the absolute power to crush him into dust. The silence in the dining room was so absolute it felt like a vacuum, broken only by the ragged, uneven sound of Vaughn fighting for breath. He stared at the silver fountain pen resting beside the dossier as if it were a loaded weapon. His entire empire, the prestige, the money, the unearned arrogance, had been meticulously dismantled and laid out before him on a mahogany table. There was no clever loophole. There was no boardroom manipulation that could save him now. He looked at Senna, his eyes entirely bloodshot, stripped of the patronizing superiority he had wielded for 25 years. He was searching for a flicker of the accommodating, obedient wife he had discarded. He found nothing but the cold, impenetrable gaze of a woman who had outgrown him in every conceivable way. With a hand trembling so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel, Vaughn picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib against the heavy parchment sounded unbearably loud. He signed away his severance. He signed away his stock options. He signed over the deed to the luxury condo that was supposed to be the monument to his new, vibrant life. A single, pathetic tear of sheer humiliation slipped down his pale cheek, splashing against the leather portfolio as he finished the final signature. Evander didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply gestured to the two massive security guards who had silently materialized in the archway of the dining room. "Escort him off the premises," Evander commanded, his voice devoid of any emotion. "And ensure he is off the grounds before he calls a cab. Miss Voronova took the town car, and I do not want him lingering on my driveway." Vaughn practically stumbled as the guards gripped his arms. He didn't look back as he was hauled out of the grand dining room, his expensive shoes dragging across the marble foyer. The heavy oak front doors opened, and he was thrust out into the biting, freezing Chicago wind. He stood alone in the dark, staring down the mile-long, tree-lined driveway of the estate, realizing he had absolutely nothing to his name but the clothes on his back. Back inside the warmth of the dining room, Senna stood slowly. She walked over to the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, Apollo padding softly beside her, and watched Vaughn's tiny, defeated silhouette begin the long, agonizing walk in the cold. She expected to feel a rush of vicious adrenaline. Instead, what washed over her was a profound, breathtaking lightness. The invisible chain that had bound her to that man's ego for 2.5 decades simply dissolved. Evander came up behind her, wrapping his arms securely around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. The warmth of his chest against her back anchored her perfectly. "It is done," he whispered, his deep voice vibrating against her. Senna leaned back into his embrace, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the chandelier. "Yes," she murmured, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across her face. "It really is." 6 months later, the name Vaughn Kincaid was nothing but a ghost in the halls of the Apex conglomerate. Senna sat on the sprawling stone terrace of the Hayes estate, the morning sun casting a warm, golden glow over the immaculate gardens. Apollo rested his heavy head on her knee, while Artemis chased shadows near the fountain. In Senna's hand was a tablet displaying a minor, buried article in a local business column. It detailed the quiet bankruptcy of a former Chicago executive, noting that he had recently taken a grueling, entry-level logistics position in a grim industrial town just to make ends meet. She read the headline, felt absolutely nothing, and casually turned the screen off. The opposite of love wasn't hate, it was total, unbothered apathy. Footsteps sounded behind her. Evander stepped onto the terrace, carrying 2 cups of steaming black coffee. He wore a simple cashmere sweater, looking entirely relaxed, the heavy burden of his corporate empire momentarily set aside. He handed her a cup and kissed the crown of her head, his silver eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Any news worth reading?" he asked, taking the seat beside her. "Nothing of consequence," Senna smiled, leaning into his shoulder. She looked out over the sprawling grounds, breathing in the crisp morning air. She was 48, vibrant, deeply loved, and entirely free. She hadn't just survived the destruction of her past, she had used the wreckage to build a fortress. Evander intertwined his fingers with hers, the heavy, flawless diamond on her hand catching the morning light. They didn't need to say anything else. The war was over and the queen had kept her crown. Have you ever watched someone lose absolutely everything because they couldn't see the value of what was standing right in front of them? Do you believe karma always balances the scales? Or did Senna and Evander simply outplay a man blinded by his own ego? What would you have done if you were handed the power to destroy the person who broke your heart? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story of ultimate payback and finding true love after the fall, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time on Midnight Romance.